Ezra Calloway sat in the cramped cockpit of the Iron Rose, the dim glow of old, flickering screens reflecting off his worn face. He was a mechanic by trade, not a pilot, but life in the outer colonies didn't leave much room for choice. Work was scarce, and desperate times called for desperate measures. His cargo run-aid's simple delivery of spare parts and scrap metal was supposed to be routine. Easy credits for a man trying to survive on the fringes of the galaxy. He ran a hand through his unkempt hair, eyes scanning the navigation screen, the dull hum of the ship's engine filling the silence. A tremor ran through his robotic left leg, an all-too-familiar reminder of the harsh realities of his past. The limb, built from spare parts and salvaged circuitry, wasn't top of the line, but it kept him going. Ezra had gotten used to the clunky sound of its motor, the slight limp that marked every step he took. He had to. A low warning beep interrupted his thoughts, and he sat up straight. Unstable gravity well detected, the onboard computer announced in its monotone, almost bored voice. Ezra's eyes darted to the readout. His heart skipped a beat. "That's not supposed to be there," he muttered to himself, pulling up the system's diagnostics. There it was, a gravitational anomaly dead ahead, pulling the Iron Rose off course, dragging it toward an uncharted planet. "Perfect," Ezra groaned, slamming his fist against the console. He'd heard of rogue planets and unmarked dangers on the galactic fringe, but he hadn't expected to fly straight into one. His hands flew across the controls, trying to reroute power to the ship's stabilizers. The engine groaned in protest, the hull creaking under the stress. Suddenly, the ship bucked violently, throwing Ezra against the console. Lights flashed red. Alarms blared. His vision blurred for a moment, but he could see it through the shattered viewscreen, the planet looming larger and larger, an ominous sphere of swirling clouds and jagged mountain ranges. The ship spun out of control, metal screeching as it ripped through the upper atmosphere. Ezra grabbed the control stick with his cybernetic arm, teeth gritted as he fought to stabilize the descent. His leg strained under the force, the mechanical joint whining as it absorbed the shock. But it was no use, the ship was going down. Brace for impact, the computer droned as if the entire ship wasn't already coming apart at the seams. Ezra barely had time to register the words before the ground rose up to meet him. The impact hit like a bomb. The Iron Rose crashed into the surface of the planet with a deafening roar, tearing a jagged trench through the rocky terrain. Ezra felt the ship crumple around him, metal shrieking, consoles exploding in sparks. He was thrown from his seat, slamming hard against the cold, unforgiving bulkhead. His robotic leg took the brunt of the impact, but pain flared up his flesh and blood side, sharp and unrelenting. For a moment, there was silence. Just the slow hiss of escaping air, the groan of settling wreckage, and the faint crackle of broken electronics. Ezra lay there, dazed, his vision swimming as his brain tried to catch up with what had just happened. When he finally blinked away the haze, the first thing he noticed was the sky. Purple. A deep, unnatural shade, streaked with swirling silver clouds. The cockpit canopy was shattered, letting in a rush of cool, alien air. Ezra coughed, wincing as he pulled himself upright, pain stabbing at his ribs. Still alive. Somehow, he muttered, wiping blood from his brow. His leg buzzed and sputtered as he tried to stand, the servos struggling to engage. His chest heaved with the effort, but after a few tense seconds, the mechanical limb responded, lifting him to his feet. He scanned the wreckage. The Iron Rose was beyond saving. The ship had broken in two on impact, one half buried in the rocky soil, the other scattered across the jagged landscape like the bones of some ancient beast. Ezra winced as he surveyed the damage. The cargo was gone, the ship's systems were offline, and most importantly, there was no sign of his crew. Great. Just great, he muttered, limping toward the remains of the cockpit console. He tapped a few buttons, but the screen stayed black. No power. No communications. He was stranded. Alone. Stepping out of the wreckage, Ezra took his first real look at the planet. It was desolate, the ground covered in dark, obsidian-like rock, twisted and broken by violent geological activity. In the distance, towering mountains loomed, their jagged peaks cutting through the strange, violet sky. Strange plants, alien flora that glowed faintly in the dim light clung to the edges of the cliffs, swaying unnaturally in a wind that Ezra couldn't feel. The air was thick with an electric charge, making the hairs on his neck stand on end. But it wasn't the landscape that concerned him the most. It was the sounds, the low, distant howls that echoed across the valley, followed by sharp, guttural screeches. They sent a shiver down his spine. "Not alone," he muttered, eyes scanning the horizon. His hand instinctively moved to his side, where he kept an old, battered plasma cutter. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it would have to do. As the sun, or whatever the star of this forsaken planet was, began to set, the landscape grew darker, the strange, purple light fading into an eerie twilight. Ezra limped back toward the ship, his mechanical leg clicking with every step. He needed shelter. Protection. The beasts, whatever they were getting closer. He could feel it in the air, the way the ground trembled beneath his feet. His mind raced as he scavenged what he could from the wreckage: tools, scraps of metal, a ration pack half crushed under a fallen beam. He would need all of it if he was going to survive the night. As he settled into the remains of the cockpit, using the ship's shattered hull as a makeshift barrier, Ezra couldn't help but wonder, how far from home was he? How long would it take for anyone to find him? Would they even bother? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, piercing howl. Closer this time. Ezra gripped the plasma cutter tightly, his heart pounding in his chest. He was a mechanic, not a soldier, but if these beasts thought he was easy prey, they were in for a rude awakening. "I'm not dying on this rock," he whispered to himself, eyes narrowing as he stared out into the growing darkness. The howls grew louder, and Ezra's grip tightened. His survival had only just begun. Ezra Calloway woke to the sharp scent of alien air filling his lungs. The night had been long and restless, with every creak of the wreckage and every distant howl reminding him just how precarious his situation was. As the dim, purple light of Zenthor's star rose over the jagged mountains, he sat up and winced, his ribs aching from the crash. His robotic leg groaned as he stood, the servo motor still sputtering from the rough landing. Ezra cursed under his breath. The leg was his lifeline out here. If it failed, he was as good as dead. He limped to what was left of the Iron Rose's storage compartment, digging through the wreckage for tools and supplies. But there wasn't much, just a half-empty toolbox, a busted power cell, and a few emergency rations. With a grunt, Ezra pulled out a spanner and began tinkering with his leg. It wasn't the first time it had malfunctioned, and he was more than capable of making repairs. The joint was misaligned, and the motor was clogged with debris from the crash. As he worked, the eerie silence of the planet weighed heavily on him, broken only by the occasional, distant roar of the beasts that roamed the wilderness. Zenthor was a world far beyond the edge of human colonization. No star charts, no space stations, not even a relay satellite. Just a hostile, alien landscape that had somehow drawn him into its deadly embrace. And those creatures, whatever they were the apex predators here. He shuddered at the memory of the night before. He had caught only glimpses of them, massive, black-scaled forms that moved through the darkness like shadows, their glowing blue eyes watching him from the edge of the wreckage. They hadn't attacked, not yet, but Ezra could feel their hunger. They were watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Gotta move," Ezra muttered to himself, tightening the last bolt on his leg. He tested it, bending the joint and listening for the hum of the motor. It was functional, for now, but he knew it wouldn't last forever. He stuffed what little he could carry into a battered pack and started off toward the distant mountains. There had to be water, shelter, something that could keep him alive until he found a way off this rock. His steps were uneven, his limp more pronounced as his robotic leg struggled to adjust to the jagged terrain. The rocky ground was unforgiving, each step jarring his already bruised body. Hours passed as he trudged through the wasteland, the strange, alien flora casting an iridescent glow in the faint light. The trees, or what he thought were trees, were twisted and gnarled, their bark shimmering like metal. Thick vines with pulsating veins clung to the rocky outcrops, shifting in the breeze or perhaps moving of their own accord. Ezra kept his distance, not wanting to touch anything that might prove deadly. He knew better than to trust the beauty of alien worlds. As the day dragged on, Ezra's throat grew parched, and the ache in his leg intensified. The heat from Zenthera's sun was oppressive, beating down on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. His survival instincts kicked in. He needed water, and fast. His eyes scanned the horizon, searching for any signs of a stream, a pool, anything. But it wasn't water that caught his attention. A deep, rumbling growl echoed through the rocky hills. Ezra froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the plasma cutter at his belt. His pulse quickened as the growl grew louder, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footfalls. He turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. There, in the distance, moving through the shadows of the alien forest, was one of the beasts. It was massive, easily standing over 8 feet tall, with a sleek, black-scaled body that shimmered in the purple light. Its 4 muscular legs moved with terrifying grace, and its long, sinuous tail whipped through the air behind it. Its head was broad and reptilian, with a mouth full of jagged teeth that gleamed as it opened its jaws in a low, rumbling snarl. But it was the eyes that chilled Ezra to his core. They glowed an eerie blue, intelligent and hungry, scanning the landscape with deadly precision. Ezra's grip tightened on the plasma cutter, though he knew it was a futile defense. The creature was far too large, too fast. He swallowed hard, trying to stay calm, trying to think. The beast hadn't noticed him yet. He was downwind, and the wind was carrying his scent away. But it wouldn't be long before it spotted him. He had to move. Slowly, carefully, Ezra crouched behind a large, jagged boulder, his heart racing. He peered out, watching as the beast prowled closer, sniffing the air, its eyes narrowing as it searched for prey. Every muscle in his body tensed. Just a little farther, and it would be right on top of him. Suddenly, a deafening screech rang out from somewhere deeper in the forest. Ezra flinched, his pulse spiking as the beast's head whipped around, its glowing eyes locking onto the source of the sound. Another screech, followed by a chorus of alien roars. Ezra didn't know what was out there, but whatever it was, it had the creature's full attention. The beast let out a low growl, then bounded off toward the sound, its massive body moving with terrifying speed and agility through the underbrush. Ezra exhaled slowly, his hands shaking as he holstered the plasma cutter. That was too close, he muttered, wiping the sweat from his brow. He glanced around, his mind racing. The beasts were hunting in packs. There were more of them, possibly nearby. Staying out in the open wasn't an option. He needed to find higher ground, a defensible position where he could see them coming. Ezra pushed forward, moving faster now, his leg aching with every step. The terrain grew steeper as he approached the base of the mountains, the ground shifting beneath his feet. The howls of the creatures echoed through the hills, a constant reminder that he was being hunted. After what felt like hours, Ezra finally reached a rocky outcrop that jutted out from the mountain. He climbed up, pulling himself over the edge with his cybernetic arm, gasping for breath as he collapsed onto the cool stone surface. From this vantage point, he could see the alien forest sprawling out before him, a sea of twisted trees and glowing plants. The beasts were out there, stalking the shadows, but for now, they hadn't found him. Ezra leaned against the rock, wiping the sweat from his brow. His mouth was dry, his limbs heavy with exhaustion, but he couldn't afford to stop. Not yet. As he sat there, staring out over the landscape, something caught his eye, a distant, faint glimmer of light, flickering on the horizon. His heart skipped a beat. Was it a fire? A signal? Another ship? He squinted, trying to make out the source, but it was too far away to tell. Whatever it was his only hope. If there were others on this planet, humans, or even some form of intelligent life, they might have resources, away off this cursed rock. But to get there, he'd have to cross miles of hostile terrain, with the beasts prowling every step of the way. Ezra's hand brushed against his leg, feeling the worn, scarred metal beneath his fingertips. The joint creaked as he shifted, reminding him that time was running out. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't hide forever. He had to move. Grimacing, Ezra stood and gathered his gear, his eyes fixed on the distant light. He didn't know what waited for him out there, whether it was friend or foe, but he had no other choice. With a deep breath, he began the long, treacherous journey into the unknown, knowing that the alien beasts of Zenthera were never far behind. Ezra Calloway pushed forward, each step more labored than the last. His robotic leg, once a sturdy asset that carried him through countless hostile environments, was now a ticking time bomb of malfunctioning servos and misfiring circuits. The heat from Zinthra's alien sun bore down on him, turning the already harsh trek across the rocky terrain into a brutal test of endurance. His body was worn, his mind exhausted, and the faint glimmer of light on the horizon, the beacon of hope that had kept him going, was still so far away. It had been days since Ezra had seen the beasts. But their howls never stopped. Every night, they pierced the silence like a haunting reminder of the ever-present danger. He could feel their eyes on him, always watching from the cover of the twisted, alien forest. The glistening, black-scaled predators had become his constant shadow, always lurking just beyond sight, waiting for him to falter. And now, faltering seemed inevitable. Ezra stumbled, his leg catching on a jagged rock. The motor in his robotic limb whined in protest, sparks shooting from the knee joint as it gave out beneath him. He hit the ground hard, the wind knocked from his lungs as he slid across the sharp, obsidian-like stones. Pain radiated through his chest, and he gasped for air, his vision blurring for a moment. "Damn it," he spat, slamming his fist into the ground. He rolled onto his back, staring up at the violet sky, frustration and exhaustion weighing heavily on him. His body screamed for rest, for reprieve, but his instincts told him that stopping here was as good as surrendering to death. The beasts were closing in. They knew he was weak, and soon they would strike. Ezra sat up, groaning as his robotic leg twitched uselessly at his side. He inspected the damage, his hands shaking as he ran his fingers over the exposed wiring and scorched metal. The knee joint was completely shot, his last patch job hadn't held, and now the motor was fried. It was only a matter of time before the leg became a dead weight, leaving him stranded, immobile, and defenseless. His mind raced. He was a mechanic, a damn good one at that. He had fixed countless machines with fewer tools and worse conditions than this. But his supplies were running low, and Zinthra's alien wilderness didn't exactly offer up spare parts on a silver platter. Still, giving up wasn't an option. Ezra dug into his pack, pulling out what little he had left, a few tools, some broken power cells, and a bundle of wires he'd salvaged from the wreckage of the Iron Rose. He glanced around, scanning the desolate landscape for anything that might be of use. There wasn't much, just rock, dust, and the faint hum of alien flora in the distance. He took a deep breath, his mind working through the problem. His leg needed power, and more importantly, it needed stability. The servo motor was beyond repair, but if he could reroute some of the remaining power cells, he might be able to get the joint moving again, at least enough to keep him going until he could find help. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all he had. Hours passed as Ezra worked, his hands steady despite the exhaustion gnawing at the edges of his vision. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the rocky landscape. The purple sky darkened, and the distant howls of the alien beasts echoed once again through the night air. Ezra didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. Sweat dripped down his brow as he connected the last of the wires, fusing the damaged motor with a salvaged power cell. His fingers were raw and bleeding from the sharp edges of the metal, but he barely noticed. All that mattered was making the leg functional just enough to carry him a few more miles. He flipped the switch, holding his breath. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a faint spark, the motor whirred to life. It sputtered, hissed, but the knee joint moved. Ezra let out a sigh of relief, a small grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. The leg was still unstable, the motor fragile and prone to failure, but it was moving. "Good enough," he muttered, wiping his hands on his pants. He stood, testing the leg. It creaked and groaned under the strain, but it held. For now. Ezra gathered his gear, slinging the pack over his shoulder. The glimmer of light on the horizon, the distant hope of salvation, was still there, faint but unwavering. He set his jaw and began walking again, each step slow, careful, but steady. The night stretched on, and the howls grew louder. Ezra's heart pounded in his chest as he climbed over rocky outcrops and descended into valleys filled with alien flora that glowed faintly in the darkness. Every movement was agony, but he forced himself onward, refusing to give in to the pain. Then, without warning, the ground shifted beneath him. Ezra stumbled, his foot catching in a tangle of thick, vine-like roots that seemed to pulse with an eerie, internal light. He cursed, yanking his leg free, but the moment of distraction was all it took. The air grew cold. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He wasn't alone. Ezra froze, his hand instinctively moving to the plasma cutter at his belt. His eyes scanned the darkness, searching for any sign of movement. The landscape was quiet, too quiet. The howls had stopped. Then he saw a shadow, massive and looming, moving through the twisted trees ahead. Its eyes glowed a deep, unnatural blue, cutting through the darkness like beacons of death. The beast was here. And this time, it wasn't alone. A second pair of glowing eyes appeared to the right. Then another, and another. They were circling him, closing in from all sides. Ezra's breath quickened, his mind racing. He couldn't outrun them, not with his leg in the condition it was. He couldn't fight them head-on either. The plasma cutter wouldn't be enough against creatures this size, not with how fast they moved. He needed a plan, and he needed it now. The creatures moved closer, their sleek, black-scaled bodies blending into the shadows. Ezra could hear their low growls, the rumble of their massive claws scraping against the rock. His heart raced. If they attacked now, it was over. His eyes darted to the landscape around him. The tangle of glowing vines, the jagged rocks, the unstable terrain, it was all dangerous. But maybe, just maybe, he could use it to his advantage. Without hesitation, Ezra lunged toward the thickest part of the vines, his leg groaning in protest as he moved. The beasts roared behind him, their glowing eyes narrowing as they saw their prey making a desperate dash for cover. Ezra grabbed the plasma cutter from his belt, slashing through the vines as fast as he could. The tendrils hissed and writhed as they were severed, oozing a strange, glowing liquid that steamed in the cold air. He had to be quick. The creatures were gaining on him. Finally, the vines fell away, revealing a deep crevice in the rock, a narrow passage just wide enough for him to squeeze through. Without a second thought, Ezra dove into the crevice, his robotic leg scraping against the jagged stone as he pulled himself through the narrow gap. Behind him, the beasts roared in frustration, their massive bodies too large to follow him into the tight space. Ezra panted, his chest heaving as he collapsed against the cool stone. The beasts clawed at the entrance, snarling and snapping, but they couldn't reach him. For now, he was safe. But Ezra knew this was only a temporary reprieve. His leg was barely functioning, and the creatures wouldn't give up so easily. They would wait, circling, watching, ready to strike the moment he emerged. He leaned his head back against the rock, staring up at the narrow sliver of purple sky above him. The light on the horizon was still there, distant and unreachable. But he wasn't giving up. Not yet. "Come on, Calloway," he whispered to himself, gripping the plasma cutter tightly. "You're not done. Not by a long shot." The beasts snarled outside, their glowing eyes never leaving the crevice. Ezra took a deep breath, his mind already working on the next plan. He wasn't going to die on this planet. Not today. Ezra Calloway leaned heavily against the cool stone wall of the narrow crevice, the faint glow from his malfunctioning leg casting eerie shadows around him. The snarls and guttural growls of the alien beasts echoed from the entrance to his hiding spot, their frustration palpable. They were close, too close, and he knew they were only waiting for him to make a mistake. His heart raced, but his mind was already working on an escape plan. He couldn't stay hidden forever. The narrow crevice had provided a brief reprieve, but his leg was deteriorating fast, and the beasts were patient hunters. They would wait as long as necessary. His only option was to outsmart them, and in this unforgiving alien landscape, that would require more than brute force or luck. It would require every bit of ingenuity he had left. Ezra reached into his pack, pulling out the remaining scraps he'd scavenged from the wreckage of the Iron Rose. Worn wires, a damaged power cell, and a few shards of metal. None of it was ideal, but it would have to do. He had always been good at improvising. It was what had kept him alive this long. The plasma cutter was still warm in his hand, its faint hum a reassuring sound in the darkness. He had an idea, a desperate one, but if it worked, it might just buy him enough time to reach the distant light that flickered on the horizon. If it didn't work, well, he wouldn't have much time to worry about it. Ezra bent over his robotic leg, sweat dripping down his brow as he worked to make quick, crude repairs. He rewired the power cell, overcharging it with the last of his energy reserves. The leg sparked, sputtered, and hissed, but after a tense few seconds, it powered on. It wasn't a permanent fix, in fact. He'd probably only get a few hours out of it before the entire thing burned out, but it was enough to move. That would have to be enough. The creatures outside snarled again, their glowing blue eyes peering through the narrow gap in the rocks. Ezra's time was running out. He had to act fast. He steadied the alien terrain through the crack in the rock. The beasts were massive, too large to fit into the tight space he had crawled into, but they were quick and agile in the open. He needed to create a distraction, something that would buy him enough time to get past them and make a run for the distant light. Ezra looked down at the plasma cutter and the overcharged power cell now wired into his leg. He had seen this trick work before in spaceports and junkyards: create a controlled explosion, something big enough to scare off predators or draw them away. If he could rig the plasma cutter to overload using the damaged power cell, he could create a blast that would scatter the beasts and give him a few precious minutes to escape. He glanced at the crevice entrance. The beasts were pacing now, restless and agitated. One of them let out a low, rumbling growl, and Ezra's pulse quickened. He had no time left. He quickly set to work, disconnecting the plasma cutter's safety circuits and rigging the power cell to overload. The device hummed louder, growing hotter in his hand as it approached critical mass. Sweat poured down his face, but his hands remained steady. He had one shot at this. Finally, with the makeshift bomb armed and ready, Ezra looked toward the exit. The beasts were still there, their massive forms blocking the only way out. His robotic leg whirred faintly, already showing signs of strain from the overcharge. He'd have to run fast and hope the leg held up long enough for him to reach safety. Ezra took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "All right, Calloway," he muttered to himself. "Let's do this." With a swift motion, he tossed the overloaded plasma cutter out of the crevice and into the open. The beasts growled, their attention snapping toward the small, sparking device as it landed with a heavy thud on the rocky ground. For a brief moment, everything was still. Then, the plasma cutter exploded. The explosion rocked the valley, sending shards of rock and debris flying in every direction. The beasts recoiled in surprise, letting out high-pitched screeches as they were momentarily blinded and disoriented by the bright flash of light and heat. The ground trembled beneath Ezra's feet, and he didn't waste a second. He burst from the crevice, his damaged leg sparking and grinding as he sprinted as fast as it would allow. The alien creatures howled in fury as they shook off the shock of the explosion, their glowing blue eyes locking onto Ezra's retreating form. They charged after him, their massive claws tearing through the rocky terrain with terrifying speed. Ezra could feel the ground shake with each of their thunderous steps. His leg was barely holding together, the motor straining under the effort, but he didn't look back. Ahead of him, the distant light, his beacon of hope, flickered in the growing darkness. It was closer now, but still miles away. He pushed forward, forcing his body to keep moving, even as exhaustion clawed at the edges of his consciousness. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart hammering in his chest. Behind him, the alien beasts roared, gaining on him with every passing second. Ezra's leg began to sputter, the motor finally giving out under the strain. He stumbled, nearly falling as the leg buckled beneath him. Desperation gripped him, but he forced himself to keep going, using the jagged rocks for support as he dragged his failing limb behind him. The light was so close now. He could make out a structure, something metallic and humanoid in shape, standing tall against the alien landscape. It wasn't just a light, it was a beacon, a signal. Someone or something was there. But the beasts were closing in. With one final, desperate burst of energy, Ezra pushed himself forward, his legs sparking wildly with every step. He could hear the beasts' breath, feel the heat of their presence as they bore down on him. Then, Just as one of the creatures lunged, its claws outstretched, the ground beneath Ezra's feet lit up. A blinding beam of light shot down from the structure ahead, slamming into the ground between Ezra and the pursuing beasts. The creatures shrieked in surprise, skidding to a halt as the beam scorched the earth. Another beam followed, then another, forming a barrier of burning light between Ezra and the beasts. Ezra collapsed to the ground, gasping for air as he stared up at the towering figure that had saved him. It was a ship sleek, advanced, and unmistakably alien. Its hull glowed with the same iridescent light he had seen on the horizon, and as it descended toward him, a ramp extended from its underside. A figure appeared at the top of the ramp. Humanoid, but tall and elegant, with metallic skin that shimmered in the dim light of Zenthera's star. The alien's eyes glowed with a soft, golden light as they looked down at Ezra with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "You are far from home, human," the alien said in a deep, melodic voice. Ezra, still gasping for breath, could barely manage a nod. "Yeah. No kidding." The alien extended a hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Ezra took it, allowing the alien to pull him to his feet. His leg gave out beneath him, the motor finally dead, but the alien caught him, supporting his weight as they led him up the ramp and into the ship. As they entered the sleek, glowing interior, the ramp closed behind them, and the ship began to rise. Ezra glanced back one last time, watching as the beasts roared in frustration, unable to reach him through the barrier of light. He had made it. Against all odds, he had survived. As the ship ascended into Zenthera's purple sky, Ezra leaned back against the cool metal walls, closing his eyes in exhaustion. He didn't know where this alien ship was taking him, or who these beings were, but at that moment, none of that mattered. He was alive. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he was safe. The ship hummed softly as it broke through the atmosphere, leaving the planet of the alien beasts far behind. Ezra let out a long, tired sigh. "Not such a bad ending after all," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper as sleep finally claimed him.